Hi everyone, welcome back to another Caffeine, Crimes and Chills episode. Grab your tea, your coffee, your water, your wine, whatever it is that you're having, and don't forget to subscribe if you want to see more videos like this one. If you missed my last video, we talked about William Parker's House of Horrors, a true crime tale that left behind a horrific legacy and a haunted house. And so I'll link that above somewhere up here, and now that all that is out of the way, let's get on with this video. So Culross is largely accepted as being one of Scotland's most picturesque villages, with its whitewashed houses and its red tile roofs, sitting proudly on beautiful cobbled streets that date back centuries. The once quiet and unremarkable village grew in popularity in the 1500s from a mixture of coal mining and salt production in the area. This took Culross to newfound wealth and recognition. It's common for visitors to feel as though they have stepped back in time when they walk the streets of Culross, as they walk around the ancient side streets and up and down the streets that people of the past once knew. And of course they should, because the village dates back to the 6th century, when Saint Cerf, now I'm not very good with sort of pronunciations of words I don't know. Now, just in case I butchered the pronunciation, I'm going to leave the name on the screen. But Saint Cerf came across from Rome, where he had served as a pope for 6 or 7 years, and he came across and eventually ended up in Culross. Now, legend has it that Saint Cerf was the sort of adopted father of the more well-known Saint Mungo, who was the illegitimate child of a princess named Tenyu, who had fallen pregnant, and her family were very upset about this situation, and as you do, they just threw her off a cliff. Thankfully, Tenyu survived this sort of attempt on her life and the life of her unborn baby, and she ended up getting on a boat and sailing across the Firth of Forth, where she landed in Culross and ended up being sort of taken under the wing of Saint Cerf, who mentored her son. Whilst the world outside of Culross changed and evolved over time, and a lot of places built over the history that they had once had there, Culross has managed to maintain a lot of its old world charm, which has earned it a fair amount of tourism and a fair amount of interest online from things such as Pinterest boards, Instagram posts, and also the setting of the US TV series Outlander. Yes, that's right, if you watched Outlander, Culross is the setting of the town. But not everything in Culross is picture perfect, because lying beneath the postcard-worthy facade lies a darker tale. A tale that saw 32 women of the town being accused of witchcraft, a crime that really only brought forth one outcome, and that was death. Surely witches are really easy to spot. You've got the black pointed hats, you've got the black cats, you've got the broomsticks, and of course not forgetting the cauldron. But no, the people who were accused of devil worship were actually none other than everyday women just leading ordinary lives. The 16th to the 18th century was rife over witchcraft allegations. This is a time when the lay population were mainly uneducated and couldn't read for themselves, and so they really just relied on what their ministers would tell them at the time. They relied heavily on these educated men to keep them safe and spread the appropriate word of God. Not having the ability to read or write themselves, these people were unable to fact check and get their information from exterior sources, and so anything that they were told just sort of became ingrained into them as the absolute truth. So if you had a minister who was prone to throwing about hellfire and brimstone and talking about witches that were cavorting with the devil and throwing some dark mass in the evenings in the local churchyard, these stories went unquestioned and allowed fear and mistrust to sort of fester within the community. And so when things began to go wrong, as they invariably do, deaths, illnesses, adverse weather, fires, scientific reasoning never went into the explanations of what had happened. And so the people who had experienced these misfortunes went back on their teachings and the things that they had learned in life from their ministers, and therefore it became just absolutely obvious that the reason that these misfortunes were befalling the people of the town, it had to be witches. Religion is the opiate of the masses indeed. During this fraught time period, around 4,000 men, women and children were accused of witchcraft. However, predominantly the accusations were against women, as they made up about 85% of the cases in Scotland overall. This is because women were generally thought of as the weaker sex, and therefore they were less likely to be able to resist the charms of the devil when he came calling. Because as we all know, we women need to focus our pretty little heads on nothing else but housework, because otherwise the devil will come calling and we're just prone to selling our souls. Now, contrary to popular myth, it wasn't just midwives and healers that were accused, because I used to wonder why people were going around sort of spouting out herbal remedies when they knew this would likely get them in trouble with the sort of witch pointers. But no, in Scotland at least, it was only about 4% of the accused that were healers and midwives. And this comes from some fairly extensive research from the University of Edinburgh, where they have gone through and tried to chronicle every single person that has been accused of witchcraft during this time period, and they've compiled a list online, and it makes for some really interesting reading. And so, as I said, about 4% of the people accused were known healers and midwives. Interestingly, 6% were actually nobility, which I would never have believed if someone had told me that more nobility were accused of witchcraft than healers and midwives, but yeah, there we have it. However, over half of the accused were women in their 40s and up. These women were often widowed or unmarried, and that made them a much easier target for these accusations because they had no good man to just keep them out of trouble and keep his eye on them. Another unfortunate consequence of these witchcraft accusations is that people believed that bad blood ran in the family. So if you were unfortunate enough to have a great grandma who just upset the wrong person, who then pointed the finger at your grandma as a witch and she burned at the stake, there's a good chance that years and years later people are going to be side-eyeing you in the street too, thinking that you're off to a midnight mass with the demons. Now this figure probably was not helped by the 1597 release of the book Demonology. You can actually still buy this book today, and I do believe several sources have translated it so that it is not ye olde Englishy anymore. You can get it in sort of more modern words. But this book carried some serious clout because it was written by none other than King James VI of Scotland, who was absolutely obsessed with witches and demons, and yeah, he just really did not help this situation at all. His book fell at a time when suspicions were already high, and therefore his publication gave massive credence to the overall notion of witches. Who knows, maybe if the king hadn't released a book like this, maybe there would have been a lot more lives spared over this time period. Now back in Culrus, tensions were running high. The central belt of Scotland was already becoming rife with accusations of witchcraft, and so inevitably this social epidemic spilled out onto the cobbled streets of Culrus, resulting in 32 people of the village being tarred with the accusation of witchcraft and sorcery. Now it would take far too long in this video to go through every single one of these people, and the information online is sketchy to say the least because it is so old. However, I have got a handful of people to talk about here today that will just give you a bit of a taster of the times. Well, in the summer of 1675, a coven of 4 women went on trial with the accusations of witchcraft. These women were Catherine Sands, Elizabeth Inglis, Janet Hendry and Agnes Hendry, and before their trial they would have been held and tortured to solicit a confession of sorts. The riches of Culrus were held in the old townhouse, and although there's a lot of information online about the various torture techniques used in Culrus at the time, it seemed that the favoured method of soliciting a confession was to subject the women to total sleep deprivation. Now bizarrely, at the time this was not seen as a torture technique. This was just seen as a very effective method to wear down any accused of any crime. It wasn't just witchcraft, it was basically any crime that you could be held for, because holding people and stopping them from sleeping at all seemed to yield the best results in getting the confession to come forth. Very unfortunately, what they didn't know at the time is that the effects of sleep deprivation on the body and the mind would have brought forward symptoms that would have looked very much to the unenlightened jailers of the time like demonic possession. Glazed eyes, emotional outbursts, slurred nonsensical speech would have very quickly afflicted the accused when just days prior they had been acting like a normal person and completely hiding their satanic pacts from the world around them. Funny that, isn't it? Another unfortunate side effect of sleep deprivation is hallucinations. And so if you picture that you have been talking to a friend and that friend has been on a cruise and they're telling you all about it and they're telling you about the choppy water that they were on, and you go to bed, that night you might have a dream that you're on a sinking ship, and you wake up and you wonder where that crazy dream came from, and then you remember your friend went on about her cruise for the last 20 minutes before you went to bed, and that is where you got the dream from, and it sticks in your head and you might have a laugh to yourself thinking, yeah, you caused that dream. However, for the accused of witchcraft, they would have been repeatedly being told that they were talking to the devil, that they were friends with the devil, that they'd made pacts, that they'd renounced their baptisms, and so when they were now being stopped from sleeping, and so when these hallucinations hit, which were effectively your sleep merging with your wakeful mind, after you've been told that you've been hanging out with your pal Lucifer for the past however long, who do you think you're going to see when you start to have hallucinations? So now you've got yourself a jailer who can attest very truthfully that he has witnessed the accused communicating with an entity that no one else can see, and boom, you've got yourself a witch. So Catherine Sands was a married woman who was in the very unfortunate position of having a mother who had been executed for witchcraft 34 years previous. And as we all know, witchcraft is handed down through the generations, and so Catherine was always going to be on the radar of anybody looking for witches in the village. Catherine eventually confessed to giving up her baptism by putting one hand on her head and the other one on her foot so that she could hand over her body and her soul to Satan by touching her head and her foot. She further went on to explain that she had danced merrily with the devil and her friends at her mother's house, because of course the evil mother. She'd been at her mother's house when the devil just turned up and decided to stop playing a flute. Sounds legit. The women also hung out at the local churchyard with the devil, and they were spotted returning home late at night, and they were seen carrying some sort of blue light which allowed them to carry out their nefarious activities under the cover of darkness. Now, why would Catherine, a respectable married woman with a good man to keep her in line, why would she go about cavorting with the devil? Well, let me tell you, she had legitimate cause. You see, Catherine was operating under revenge because Catherine's father had died and had left most of his estate to Catherine's brother. So Catherine hoped that dancing with the devil and listening to his fantastical pipe would allow her to procure some white powder whereby she could poison her brother and receive the entire estate. Revenge had finally driven her into the birthright from her mother's side, and so she was, of course, for interests of public safety, she was sentenced to be first strangled to death and then burned at the stake. Now, as for the other 3 women, they were widows, and they were all drawn into pacts with Satan for various different reasons. Agnes ended up admitting that she went into the deal with the devil because she was in poverty and she wanted the devil to allow her to want for nothing. She, of course, sold her soul to him, and then she said that the devil gave her his mark, and this mark hurt tremendously until the moment that she decided to lie with him in the biblical way, and apparently this act eased the pain of a mark. Now, Agnes wasn't alone in admitting to sleeping with the devil. Janet also said that the devil used her in the manner of the beast, as she demurely cast her eyes downward, because you don't want to be seeing that. Now, Janet was suspected of witchcraft because she had delivered an evil remark. I think she had insulted somebody, and that showed that she had been touched by darkness and that she had the demon within her. I would have probably been burned as a witch before I could even walk. However, after being heavily interrogated, Janet went a step further than the others and named another accomplice that she said was with them on the nights of the demon worship. The woman that she named was called Elspeth Hutton, and she went down as being one of the women of the accused who was present at the flute playing session by the devil. Now, Isabel Inglis also confessed to sex with devils and demons, but she went one step further and said that she had her own spirit who was her familiar, and so having her own private spirit, she could call on him from time to time to visit her, and so she was thoroughly a witch. Some might find it a little bit suspicious, just gonna put it out there, that Isabel was accused of being a witch after there was apparently some sort of eruptions going on with the neighbours, where the neighbours were a bit jealous of her, but then they discovered she was a witch. Some might find that suspicious, but who am I to judge? Now, all 4 of the first named women were eventually strangled in the gallows and burned. I couldn't find out online what happened to Elspeth, but I can only assume that it wasn't very good. Now, a few decades later, you would think that the witch hunters of Culrus had maybe moved on to better things, but no. By 1704, Lilias Adey was being held and interrogated in the townhouse for witchcraft. Now, Adey was a widow in her 60s, which would have made her a very easy target for these bloodthirsty witch hunters, and they really were thirsty for blood at this point, because in the village there had been a spate of unfortunate incidents. There were unexplained illnesses and deaths. This had led to a lot of suspicion amongst the townfolk, and a local woman and neighbour of Lilias Adey called Jeanette Bizet, or Bizet, she pointed the finger at Lilias Adey. Her accusation was described at the time as drunken ramblings, but that didn't stop her dramatically prophesying with the words, "Beware lest Lilias Adey come upon you and your child." Definitely worth dying for that, isn't it? Lilias was taken away and kept for over a month of being interrogated, so God knows what that poor woman went through, but after a month of keeping Lilias locked away in the townhouse, she eventually offered a confession of sorts. She told how she had indeed offered up her body to the devil when she met with him in a cornfield. The devil appeared to her wearing a sun hat that was protecting his very pale and cold skin, which appeared remarkable to Lilias. The devil also had cloven feet like that of a cow, and those feet he used to follow Lilias Adey wherever she went after their first meeting. He was always a few little steps behind her. Now, Lilias also admitted that she frequently began to cavort with the devil at her house, with other witches present, but when questioned and pushed, Lilias always managed to conveniently get out of naming any other witches. The names that she did put forward were already accused and known witches, and she never put forward any new names, which very probably saved a lot of women from similar mistreatment. The jailers at the time who interrogated her were often drunken jailers, and so you can only imagine what sort of pressures were put upon Lilias to give forward these names, but she never did, which I think is quite a strong testament to her character. Now, with the confession of Lilias Adey being pretty standard to what was expected of witches to say at the time, Lilias Adey's case would have been an open shut one, because there she was, an accused witch, and here she was admitting to entertaining the devil and renouncing her baptism and all of that sort of stereotypical at the time stuff. Lilias would have most likely have met her end being strangled and burned, and she would have ended up just another name on the 3,800 plus witches of Scotland that died in that time period. However, that didn't happen, and before she could be taken to trial, Lilias was actually found dead in a holding place. This left people with a very uncomfortable situation to be in, because on one hand, here we have a witch, but we can't burn her as a witch because she hasn't been tried and convicted as a witch. We know she is a witch, but we can't do anything about that now. We can't burn her now because she hasn't been tried, and they still had the innocent until proven guilty situation going on, and so they didn't know what to do with her. Also, there was the sort of suspicion of how she died. There's been a lot of speculation as to what happened and what occurred in those last few hours of Lilias's life. But two of the most likely scenarios are that either Lilias succumbed to her conditions, the neglect, the abuse, the conditions that she was in. From torture could have become infected, and don't forget she was a woman that was 60 years plus, which in that time period was quite an age to have got to. And so it isn't out of the realms of possibility that she did just succumb to her environment and ended up losing her life that way. However, there is also the speculation that Lilias may have taken her own life to spare her the humiliation of going to trial and being condemned as a witch. Lilias wasn't stupid, which she has proven by the fact that she did not name any other women to spare herself. Lilias obviously had a fair amount of intelligence, which possibly also led to her being accused as being a witch. She knew what was going to happen to her if she went to trial, and she knew that she would end her life at the hands of an unfeeling execution. So that does bring a lot of plausibility to the theory that she may have taken her own life. Eventually the decision was made to take Lilias out of the town boundaries and bury her on the shoreline between high and low tides. This was a typical burial for someone who had taken their own life, and so it wouldn't have been unusual for this to have happened. However, due to the added suspicion of Lilias having connections with the devil, they needed to make sure that she wasn't going to rise up again in order to terrorise the townfolk of the people of Culrus. And so Lilias was buried with a rather large stone put over the top of the sand to keep her down there, to stop her rising back up to meet Satan. Ironically, this attempt to bury her without any sort of identification as to who she was and take away the identity of the woman who had lived among them for 60 plus years actually ended up being the event that made Lilias Adey's name live on, because she ended up being the only recorded witch in Scotland that was buried. Now, you'd think that would be the end of Lilias' story, wouldn't you? But nope. The atrocities didn't stop there, because more than a century later, Lilias's body was dug up, yes, dug up by grave robbers who went as far as to take her skull and sell her skull and use the wood from her coffin to make sort of macabre keepsakes. The wood from her coffin ended up going to make these sort of fancy walking sticks and things, where people knew where they had gotten this wood from, and yet they were absolutely fine with using the stolen coffin of a poor woman. Now, the skull ended up in the St Andrews University Museum, where it was photographed over 100 years ago, but then after that the skull mysteriously disappeared. From what I can find online, it was in transit to go to some exhibition in Glasgow, I think, but it completely disappeared, and no one has found it since. No one has ever claimed to have it, no one has ever claimed to know where it went. It just completely disappeared, and there are still groups out there now trying to relocate Lilias Adey's skull and bring it back to the rest of her body, which is believed to still be down there in that watery grave amongst the sand. But as of now, the whereabouts of her skull remains a mystery, and I have this uncomfortable feeling that it's possibly gonna be found in some dodgy private collector's collection when they've got a skull of a witch on display. Fast forward to modern times, and in 2017 the fascination with this woman who was a victim of her times has never waned. And so in 2017, Dr. Christian Rinn and a group of other forensic artists decided to use the information that they had and the photographs of her skull and any sort of other outside information. I don't know what they need, I'm not a forensic artist, but they did it anyway. They managed to put together the face that they think Lilias Adey would have had. There's no devil horns, no sinister smile, no indication at all that this woman had anything to do with all the demons that she confessed to knowing intimately. All it shows is that there was a woman in her twilight years who fell victim to paranoia and superstition. Somewhere, somehow, we're all witches. These people were mothers, fathers, sisters, brothers. They were primarily women who were easy to use as scapegoats in times of uncertainty. The women that are talked about today, and all the others that were accused and eventually killed for witchcraft, they were all people who had thoughts and feelings and dreams and wants and fears. They had favourite foods, cherished memories, things that made them smile, things that made them feel anxious and worried. Their hearts beat right up until the time that they had the life strangled out of their bodies. They're not just stories, these are real people who went through real atrocities. And as in many cases of atrocities being committed against innocent people, the scars are still felt on the fabric of time, years, decades, even centuries later. The same could be said for the village of Kulrus, and that leads us very nicely into the next part of our story. Is it haunted? As we've discussed in this video, we've talked about how Culross has a long and very interesting history, and to anybody who's interested in the paranormal and sort of otherworldly things, the potential possibilities of finding paranormal activity in one of the town's ancient buildings seems pretty high. And you'd be correct. There are many prominent hauntings within the town of Culrus. However, let's start back at the townhouse. This is the place where the accused witches were held. And the room where all the accused were kept is no longer open to the public. People are not allowed in there. The old townhouse also features a courthouse, which was used from around 1626 to condemn prisoners of all sorts of different crimes, and once they were condemned in there, they were usually branded with the letter S for sinner and then dragged down to the bowels of the building to be held in the jails below. The building has been plagued by unseen hands pushing things to the ground. Artwork particularly has been pushed to the floor. There's been reports of light switches turning themselves on and off, plunging the confused bystanders into total darkness. Phantom footsteps have been recorded, and in typical haunted house style, there are reports of door handles being rattled and actually visibly moved. These instances have all left behind confused but not entirely surprised witnesses. But the place within the townhouse that seems to record the most paranormal activity is the room where the accused witches were held. This eerie room is now closed off to visitors, perhaps after the amount of reports of people experiencing physical symptoms whilst in its confines. Nausea, headaches, and the feeling of physical pressure being applied to the body are just some of the complaints made by visitors before they hurriedly left the scene. Added to the mystery is the bizarre discovery of a child's shoe that had never been seen before, had never been found before, but it was suddenly discovered within the room. What makes this particularly chilling is that it had long been supposed that a child haunted that room after visitors had repeatedly reported sensing the energy of a child. But of course the townhouse isn't the only building that has reported paranormal activity. The other buildings within the town have their fair amount of paranormal entities too. Culross Palace, for example, has had several sightings of a man wandering around the area wearing Tudor-style clothing. Now this man has been described as being completely tangible, and people have assumed that he is a real person, not a ghost, and thus people have followed him and tried to find out who he is and why he's there, because he shouldn't really be there, especially not dressed as a Tudor. And they followed him into rooms, but when they have gotten into these rooms, the man has disappeared. Further visitors claim to have been touched quite sharply by unseen hands, and people have claimed to experience their entire body coming out in goosebumps for no reason. And oddly, this occurrence seems to happen more in men. It seems that for whatever reason, whatever is within the palace likes to affect men more than it likes to affect women. There are also monks seen wandering through the abbey at night. And but most interestingly for me is the legend of the lost piper. Now this legend takes place in an alleged subterranean world that lives underneath Culross, and as legend has it, the entrance is somewhere near the abbey, and if you get in there and find your way through the subterranean tunnels and you get through basically, you will discover untold riches. But no one has ever discovered this entrance, save for one man in the early 1900s who was a blind piper with his dog. It's reported that this blind piper discovered the entrance to the tunnels and wandered in, followed by his dog. And his journey through the tunnels was followed above ground, as people could hear him playing his pipes as he wandered in there. It's thought that his blindness had already accustomed him to the severe darkness that he would have found underground, and he wouldn't have been put off by this, as this was just his natural state of things. And so he wandered unperturbed through the tunnels of this underground subterranean network. And the people above ground could hear him playing his bagpipes, and so they followed along the road until eventually the sounds of the piping reached West Kirk, which is a distance of about half a mile from the abbey, and all sounds of the bagpipe abruptly stopped, and no one was able to re-find the entrance, and no one ever saw the piper again. However, don't be too upset because the dog did return. So the dog made it out alive. Someone found the dog a couple of days later, but because the dog couldn't talk, the dog wasn't able to tell the story of where this piper had gone to. And so people still search to this day for this underground network of subterranean tunnels. Now I'd love to visit the village of Kulrus this year. It's high on my list of places to visit around Scotland. And you have the rich historical history, which is something that always draws me to a place, but when it has such a deep entrenchment in witchcraft and also the paranormal goings on, it's definitely a must-see for me. So I'd love to know your thoughts on this video. What do you make of the selling of parts of Lilias Adie's body and coffin to make these weird keepsakes? What are your thoughts on the missing piper and the subterranean network? I'd love to know all of your thoughts, and if you've got any, leave them down below, and I will speak to you all soon. Bye for now.